Without any further ado then, we'll get on with today's lecture. I'm really delighted and grateful to Lieutenant General David Leakey, who is Black Rod here at Parliament, who's going to talk to us about his role today at Parliament and a brief glance back into history as well. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've come dressed in the uniform of Black Rod. This is the dress-down uniform, in fact. There are frilly cuffs and a frilly jabot for the high days and holidays when knocking on doors takes place. And for many of you, I dare say that you will... sorry, I'll speak into the microphone and you might be able to hear. For many of you, I guess you associate Black Rod with knocking on the door of the House of Commons, particularly at the state opening of Parliament. I want you to know that this knocking on the door, of course I do it, and this is the instrument with which it is done. This is the Black Rod, but it is a nano part of the job. Wearing the uniform is not a nano part of the job. Every day that the House of Lords is sitting, I wear the uniform, and I'll explain during the course of my lecture, and it will become, I think, fairly obvious during the course of my lecture why I wear the uniform. But in the meantime, I thought that since you're here and you wanted to see Black Rod, I wasn't quite sure whether you'd be more interested in me as the person or the physical rod itself. I'm very happy to pass it round the room, but I would ask you to treat it with very great respect. It doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the Queen, and it has been damaged in the past by people when it's been passed around, but I would ask you to be extremely careful with it and not to scratch it. And if you look on the bottom, you'll see that there is a gold sovereign which is dated 1904. The rod itself dates from 1873, for those of you who, it's hallmarked 1873. So there it is, do pass it round quietly during the course of the lecture. I would like it back at the end. So I start with the Black Rod and do have a look at it. The Black Rod, the history of the Black Rod starts in 1348 when Edward I had completed a very successful campaign in France. I choose my words carefully. Are there any French people here? Well, he beat the French at the battles of Crécy and Calais, and this re-established the English territories in France and the English sovereign rule over those territories. And when Edward III came back to England, he wanted to reward, in a sense, the 25 people who had been his particular supporters in prosecuting this campaign. Not just the military commanders who'd commanded the troops in the campaign and helped him win the battles, but also those who'd supported him in terms of developing the strategy, the campaign, resourcing the campaign, enabling and facilitating the campaign, raising the money back home to conduct the campaign, and of course keeping the peace and keeping order back in England whilst the king and his army was abroad. And he formed these 25 top chaps he made them knights in the Order of the Garter. The Order of the Garter still exists today. There are still only 25 knights, they're not the same ones, in the Order of the Garter, and a knight is only invested, a new knight is only introduced or invested into the Order of the Garter on the death of an existing knight. And these 25 knights who Edward III appointed used to meet together with the sovereign in a castle or a palace, very often Windsor Castle, and even today, and I'm going to jump from 1348 and the 16th century to today's role to establish these linkages and that historical linkage, the historical legacy which exists and is very closely related and explains to a certain extent the current role of Black Rod. But the Order of the Garter still meets with the sovereign, actually generally only once a year, usually the second or third Monday in June. Going back to 1348, what Edward III did with these 25 knights was he'd have them in and he would have meetings with them, consultations, discussions. They were in a way his advisory council, I could say. And at these meetings they would do three things. They would have the meetings themselves, and then they would process. And don't forget, this was the sovereign with his 25 top knights in the land, and so the processions were a public spectacle. So the sovereign and his knights would dress in their finest robes, process from the meeting room to the local cathedral, chapel, church for divine service, and then they would process from the cathedral or chapel to a hall for feasting, banqueting. And these meetings would go for a day or maybe several days. Today, in this era, the Queen still summons the Knights of the Garter on the second or third Monday of June, and she has them to an extremely good lunch, brackets, I attended, in Windsor Castle. The knights then dress in those great robes and the rather daft hats with white feathers, and process with the Queen, with the royal knights. There are 25 temporal knights and as many royal knights as the Queen will appoint, and they process to St George's Chapel and have divine service, and then they process back afterwards. So you could say not much has changed, and I'll come back to that turn of phrase in just a moment, because in 1348 there wasn't a police force as we would recognise police these days. In fact, there wasn't G4S either. And yet there were at that time, to use the sort of common word, nonetheless, miscreants and delinquents, troublemakers. And the meetings which the sovereign held with the Knights of the Garter were sometimes disrupted by people who wanted to get into the meetings who weren't allowed in, or sometimes people who were in the meetings attending or being advising, or consultants who were invited into the meetings who needed to be ejected for whatever reason. And also the processions needed ordering, the ceremonial, the king and his knights in their fine robes. And so the king appointed what was known then as an usarius. Usarius is the medieval Latin for doorkeeper. And essentially what this doorkeeper did was he was responsible for access and order and discipline. Now, usarius, the modern derivation of that word, is usher. And this usher, because he was dealing with the 25 senior knights of the land, needed to be someone who was respected by those knights. And so he had to be a gentleman. And so he was known, and is known today, as the gentleman usher. But in order that both the knights and the members of the public recognised him as having authority, the king gave the gentleman usher the black rod, which is being passed round. Not this one, as I say, this one only dates from 1873. It was a tradition of black rods that when they left their post, they generally took their rod with them. But that stopped in 1873. You can see we've here in Parliament been suffering under austerity measures for a long time. But the key thing about the black rod is not the rod itself or the blackness of it. In fact, the key thing is, if you look on the top of it, if you could just hold it up for a moment, if you look on the top, there is a gold lion. And the lion is the significant part of the rod, because the lion is the symbol of royalty, and it indicates the sovereign's authority. So black rod, the gentleman usher carrying the black rod with its royal lion is a symbol of the sovereign's authority. And black rod was rather like the Knights of the Garter, personal appointment of the sovereign, and indeed today, the appointments to the Order of the Garter are made personally on the personal selection of the sovereign, not through an application process or the Prime Minister or any political process. It is entirely in the gift of the Queen, and it's a great honour. And Black Rod too was then entirely in the gift of the sovereign. I might say that today Black Rod is appointed by the sovereign, though not necessarily selected by the sovereign. But in those days, the Black Rod was selected by the sovereign because he operated amongst the Knights of the Garter, and he had the authority of the king, and he had the ear of the king. And as well as keeping order to stop members of the public getting into the meetings and ejecting miscreants and delinquents out of the meetings, Black Rod also had the role of telling the sovereign when there were knights who themselves were disruptive or disloyal, and could recommend to the king the degrading or the demoting out of the order of the knights. And the king, of course, was extremely grateful for Black Rod keeping this sort of control and order amongst the knights in the Order of the Garter. And of course, Garter had an interest in it as well, because in degrading or demoting a knight out of the order, Black Rod received a fee. And what was more, having degraded a knight out of the order, it created a vacancy, which meant that a knight could be appointed and invested into the order, for which Black Rod also received a fee. And in the 16th century, that fee was in the order of, I think it was 5 guineas. And if you multiply 5 guineas up by the retail price indicator algorithm to 2014 prices, 5 guineas and some shillings, I think it was 13 shillings, is a tidy sum. And if you're doing that maybe 2 or 3 times a year, it's a nice living. You might say, so what's all that? What's the relevance of all that to today? And sometimes when I'm limited to just 10 minutes talk, I finish the talk there and say nothing has changed. Black Rod lives in the House of Lords and does exactly the same thing today, except that I am paid a salary and I don't earn any fees anymore. But since we've got a little more time, I'll expand on the evolution of the job of Black Rod, how the role has evolved over the centuries, and how I'm employed today. In the 16th century, in fact, in the I can never remember whether it was in the 1520s or 30s, I think it might have been 1532, Henry VIII moved out of the Palace of Westminster, which was the London home of the King of England. He moved out for 2 reasons. The principal reason was that a part of the Palace of Westminster, in fact, the royal apartments, burnt, one of the many fires in the Palace of Westminster, and made his royal apartments uninhabitable, or uncomfortable at least. The second reason he moved out was that the Palace of Whitehall was nearing completion, and this was, in its day, it too burnt down, by the way, but in its day, in the 1530s, was the biggest and most splendid palace in the whole of Europe, and the king couldn't wait to move out and into that palace. And when he moved out into the Palace of Whitehall, he left behind Black Rod to look after the Palace of Westminster, which housed his Parliament. And Black Rod has remained in the Palace of Westminster ever since. And his role in the palace has expanded and contracted depending on a number of factors. I always try and remember these because I never try and speak from notes, as the 3 C's. One of the C's, I suppose, is competence. Occasionally the Black Rod has been incompetent, and sometimes absent too. The longest serving Black Rod, and by the way, there have been, either 68 or 69 black rods. You might say, well, black rod, you ought to be a bit more precise about this. The reason is we have 69 names. I think I'm the 69th name. But it is thought that one of the names never actually took up the appointment. So there have been either 68 or 69 names. Of those black rods, one held the job for 47 years. I'm not trying to break that record. I'm already 62 and I've been in the job for 3.5 years. Of the 69 black rods, one did fall foul of the sovereign and was beheaded by Henry VIII. I'm trying not to be the second black rod to fall foul of the sovereign in that way, at least. One of the reasons why the role of black rod has contracted and expanded was not only because of perhaps their competence or capability, but also because of absences. And the black rod that held the job for 47 years was in fact a naval officer, and he rose through the ranks of the Navy whilst he held the appointment as black rod from, I think he took the job as maybe even a commander or a captain, but ended up as an admiral. And he, during his tenure of black rod, went away and commanded ships of the Navy on campaigns on the other side of the globe. So he was very often an absentee black rod. And there have been others who have shared what are now mostly the roles of black rod. One was the Sergeant-at-Arms, and there has at times been a Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Lords, as well as the Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Commons, with mirrored roles, if I can put it that way. And also there has been the Lord Great Chamberlain. Now, the Lord Great Chamberlain is one of the great officers of state. It's a hereditary appointment. The appointment is, in fact, rotates between three aristocratic families of the country: the Ancaster family, originally the Duke of Ancaster, the Carrington family, and the Cholmondeley family, the Marquess of Cholmondeley. The three families, the reason it came to three families was that the title was held by the Earl of Oxford, but for reasons which are unbelievably complicated and have been taken to the courts on numerous occasions. The Earl of Oxford didn't have a male heir, and so the office of Lord Great Chamberlain was split between various relations of the Earl of Oxford, and indeed the office of the Great Lord Chamberlain is split into shares, and the shares are shared between these three families. Fortunately, the Marquess of Cholmondeley holds a 50% shareholding. The other families, the Ancasters and the Carringtons, hold a 25% shareholding each, and their shareholdings are broken down into much smaller shareholdings amongst the various relations of the family. When the sovereign dies, the Lord Great Chamberlainship moves to the next family. So the Cholmondeleys hold it at the moment. The next family to get it will be the Carringtons, if the sovereign agrees, but this has been the tradition. And when the next sovereign dies, the shareholding will move back to the Cholmondeleys, and when the following sovereign dies, the shareholding goes to the Ancaster family. So it alternates to the Cholmondeleys, and then every third sovereign it goes to the Ancasters and the Carringtons. The Lord Great Chamberlain has himself, even today, responsibility to the sovereign for the Palace of Westminster as a royal palace. And this tradition started a very long time ago, and almost the competition between the Lord Great Chamberlain and Black Rod for who is controlling and organising the Palace of Westminster has sometimes been in competition and tension and friction, and sometimes it's been by process of sort of Darwinian exclusion, one might say, by competence or absence. There was another C, and that I suppose I ought to mention it just for completeness, and that is corruptibility. And it was, quite often in the history of Black Rod has been hauled before the Lords, and indeed the Sovereign for that matter, and told to curb his hunger for fees. And Black Rod's corruptibility really came to a head, I suppose, at the end of the 19th century, when Black Rod was put finally onto a salaried basis rather than a fee basis, because at the end of the 19th century, Black Rod seemed to have rather a lot of control or influence over which bills were brought before Parliament. And in the 19th century, many bills were private bills brought in connection with, for example, the railways and in the industrialisation of our cities and countryside, canals, railways, all these sorts of developments, which were often enabled by private bills. And in order for a member to bring a private bill, space had to be made in the parliamentary timetable, and it seemed that Black Rod in the House of Lords was enabling rather a lot of private bills to be brought, and it was well known that Black Rod would do it for a very considerable fee. I'm still open to this nowadays. The fee, that is, though I have to say my influence doesn't extend to private bills. So the role of Black Rod has, as I've said, expanded and contracted, but nonetheless it revolved round those elements that I mentioned right at the very beginning at 1348, the access, order, discipline, the administration, the ceremonial, the events that went on in the Palace of Westminster, including the fabric of the buildings. I want to fast forward now, because time is running on, to 2014. And what does Black Rod do today, having given you a little bit of the historical context? I think I can describe my job very roughly and broadly as being divided into 4 parts. The first part is security, and around the houses I'm probably best known for, amongst those who work here, the members and staff, for my role in security. The Palace of Westminster is a globally iconic building. It is therefore a global iconic terrorist target, and therefore there is a requirement for security here. But not just the Palace of Westminster, all the other parliamentary buildings, of which there are 8 or 9 spread round the vicinity of the parish of Westminster and Victoria, they also need protecting, not just because of the iconic status of Parliament, but for the people who work here, the members, the high-profile members, and the fact that it is the national parliament. And some would describe it as the mother of parliaments. So it is a target, but not just for terrorists. And of course it would be a dreadful thing if there was a terrorist attack which destroyed the building itself or damaged the building, and worse, injured or killed the people who worked there. So security is very important, but also parliaments attract the attention of others, demonstrators, protesters, stunt throwers, and although in most cases protesters aren't bent on damaging people and, well, sometimes property, but not destroying property, but nonetheless, if demonstrators and stunt throwers get into the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, then reputationally it is very damaging to the status of Parliament, and of course it undermines people's confidence in our ability to secure Parliament against not just stunt throwers but more serious threats, guns, bombs and knives. So we take security very seriously. There are 15,000 people who have passes to come into the Palace of Westminster, so we run a very big vetting operation as well for all pass holders. Permanent pass holders go through a vetting process before they get a pass. There is a cybersecurity threat, as you can imagine, so there's quite a cybersecurity operation that is run here. And there are three principal people who are responsible for security in the Houses of Parliament. Myself and my opposite number in the Commons, the Sergeant-at-Arms, and we work very, very closely together. In fact, my mantra with the Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Commons is that if anybody could get a cigarette paper between the two of us, since we are responsible for the operational delivery of security on behalf of Parliament, if anyone can get a cigarette paper between the two of us, probably one of us will have to go. And there is the Parliamentary Security Director, who sits as the sort of primus inter pares of the three of us, who looks after, amongst other things, the cybersecurity aspects of Parliament, and he is the coordinating authority for things like the security policies, the intelligence and risk assessments, the threat assessments, and the overall strategies. But the operational delivery of security is vested in the Sergeant-at-Arms and myself. And the three of us work very, very closely together in delivering security for Parliament. If you go around Parliament, you will notice that there are a lot of policemen here. We have a large security force here. It's some 500 strong, round about 150 police and 350 civilian security officers who are employed by the Metropolitan Police, and it's run under a contract with the Metropolitan Police worth about £30 million a year. So the management of that contract, the 24/7 security operation, 365 days of the year, is the responsibility of that contract with the Metropolitan Police, with the Sergeant, the Black Rod, and the Parliamentary Security Director as, if you like, the customers or clients, and the Metropolitan Police as the deliverers of our hard security. And that takes up about 25% of my time. So that's security. And tied up with security is, of course, access. So all the entrances, the search and screening that goes on, turning those measures up and tuning them down depending on the threat state. Are you giving it back to me? I'd be delighted to have it back. Thank you very much. So that's security. Now, the next part of my job I'm not going to say too much about because it's quite a sensitive area. But it is business resilience, business continuity, incident management, emergency response, and disaster recovery. So just a small portfolio of subjects for which I am responsible, not just for the House of Lords, but for both houses. I chair the Business Resilience Group, which controls all those aspects I've just discussed. So whenever there is an incident here, and it doesn't have to be a security incident, it could be a major facilities failure, a flood or a fire, and we have an incident management framework that comes together, that is on call, with duty silvers and duty golds and duty bronzes, people who come on call. We have a control room, or in fact we have a variety of control rooms around the palace, because if part of the palace is on fire or flooded, then we need our incident management in another part of the palace. So we have an incident management framework which comes together and can deal with a whole spectrum of not just the incident, of course, but the consequence management of an incident. So if there's a fire or flood at the weekend, how do we then clear that up during the weekend or in a recess, and then how do we re-establish the palace for business as usual when the house and the members return, houses and the members return on the Monday. And that's the normal sort of thing you would discuss. And the same with emergency response and disaster recovery. We have a lot of plans, for example, the artwork salvage plan and the historic furniture and fittings salvage plans. So those form a whole framework of the normal sorts of things that you will find in any library, university, bank, government department, in order to keep business continuity and business resilience alive. And of course, there are relocation plans, because if the Thames should flood, for example, and Parliament be awash, or if Parliament should burn down again, we've had it down a few times, or if a worse calamity befell Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, then, or indeed parts of the Houses of Parliament or parts of the Palace of Westminster, then we have a whole spectrum of relocation plans, contingency plans, as you would expect. Those contingency plans, of course, go out of date the whole time. The alternative buildings and locations become obsolete or obsolescent or not fit for purpose because their IT network doesn't suit the changing requirements of Parliament, or the broadcasting capabilities that we have fitted need adapting and modification. So there is a constant process of refurbishing those relocation plans, and indeed we're in a major phase at the moment of upgrading those relocation plans. They're quite sensitive, obviously, for obvious reasons, and I'm not going to say any more about them, but suffice to say that Blackrod's responsible for that for both Houses of Parliament. Probably takes up about 25% of my time. The third part of my job, or third quartile of my job, is, and I describe this very loosely as event management. The event for which I suppose with which Blackrod is most closely associated is the state opening of Parliament. The state opening of Parliament, of course, people focus on the ceremonial, which you might describe as the substance of the event, which is true, and that's what people see and notice. And for members and staff who are in and around the Palace of Westminster, there's a great atmosphere on the day. It is a great ceremony, and it's the ceremony that is the eye-catching and substantive part of the day. I suppose you could say the substantive part of the day is the Queen's speech itself, but nonetheless it's very symbolic. I'm going to linger on the state opening for a moment because there are some important symbolic things about the state opening which some people don't fully get. First of all, Blackrod's responsibilities for state opening, of course the ceremonial and all the rehearsals that go with it. But then there is the fabric for the state opening of Parliament. If you walk around the Palace of Westminster on a normal business as usual day such as today, it looks glorious and wonderful. If you walk around the House of Lords chamber, in particular the House of Lords chamber, Prince's Chamber, the Royal Gallery and the robing room, there has been, in preparation for state opening, quite a transformation. I won't go through all of it, but two major parts of that are the Royal Gallery, for example, has tiered seating put into it, all covered in wonderful fabrics and high quality chairs, tiered seating for 600 in there. The other aspect which not only in those apartments I've mentioned, but extending down towards the House of Commons and Central Lobby and Members' Lobby, are the television cameras and television stands and the lighting. And it takes about 6 weeks to prepare the Palace of Westminster for the state opening of Parliament. Of course, when I say 6 weeks, some of the work starts very incrementally. Little bits of work start to be done because the Houses are still sitting, but it's in the last fortnight before the state opening of Parliament there is a major transformation of the fabric, and the miles and miles, tens of kilometres of cabling for the television cameras, the commentary boxes, commentary positions and so on, which go through. So the second part of the ceremony I've mentioned, and then the fabric. The third part, of course, is the security operation that goes with the state opening of Parliament. It is, not only is the Palace of Westminster an iconic, globally iconic building, but the state opening of Parliament is a globally iconic event, and many extra precautions are taken, and there is a pretty exhaustive security plan, for which Blackrod is responsible. I mentioned the television. The media interest in the state opening of Parliament is huge. The state event is televised globally, and it is networked out and syndicated out, and responsibility for the distribution, if you like, not only for the setting up the actual television cameras and monitors, but the cabling and the distribution out to other networks also is part of the state opening plan under Blackrod. So that's quite a major undertaking as well. And finally, there is the, if I can put it this way, the protocol of state opening of Parliament, by which I think I mean the seating plan. When you imagine the sort of people that want to come to state opening, or indeed already are in Parliament and want to attend in the chambers, there's quite a premium put on the ticketing arrangements for that. Happy to accept. So that's the state opening of Parliament, but all through the year there are events of different sorts. The state opening of Parliament is one of the biggest and most complex. There are lots of state visits. For example, in October, later this month, the President of Singapore is paying a state visit to the UK. As part of each state visit, incoming state visit, the head of state usually comes to Parliament to address the members of both Houses of Parliament. For the small visits, it's quite a small event, but there's a lot of ceremonial and protocol and security involved with it. The event takes place in the robing room. For the bigger events, such as when President Obama came, and indeed the Pope, these events take place in Westminster Hall because more people want to attend them. And consequently, the media coverage and the security and protocol arrangements expand exponentially and in proportion to the scale of the visit. And then every day there are events going on, events in each house, and the smaller events by and large tend to be run by the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Commons and Blackrod in the House of Lords. But there are smaller events which take place involving both houses. An example of that perhaps would be the Nelson Mandela commemorative event that took place in Westminster Hall last year. Aung San Suu Kyi came and addressed members of both houses and invited audience in Westminster Hall. So there are other events, and all of these things require all those elements that I mentioned before, which have to be drawn together and coordinated. So those are the three, what I might describe as substantive business parts of my role. And you might be asking, what size of staff do I have to manage all of that? It's a huge staff. It's myself and my deputy, the yeoman usher, and then the three ladies who sit in my outer office. That's it. We run it on that. And when there are major events that take place, then we matrix manage the rest of the staff in the Houses of Parliament. So, for example, in preparation for major events or visits, the Parliamentary Estates Department, their project managers and the craft team all work to a plan under Blackrod, and so we matrix manage. The Sergeant-at-Arms team in the House of Commons supports Blackrod, and I often have to draft in teams even of the clerks who come and help, particularly with some of the complex diplomatic and protocol issues which are all part of these plans. So we expand and contract the staff according to the scale and nature of the event. I've only mentioned three parts of my job if you've been looking at the structure of my talk, and the fourth part of my job doesn't really have a title, but in a way I go back to 1348, to when Edward III appointed his first Black Rod to do those things which I described, to keep order amongst the knights. And to a certain extent, in some respects, that's what Blackrod does in the House of Lords. I'm not responsible. I mean, nobody has tasked me to be responsible for the discipline of the peers. In fact, I am not responsible for the discipline of the peers. I do not make the rules up in the House of Lords either. And if a peer steps outside the rules of the House in a major way and breaches the code of conduct, as I'm sure you'll know from reading the media, then the peers are dealt with by their peers, by the committees set aside, the Conduct Committee and the Privileges Committee and the House Committee that disciplines peers for breaches of the rules or the code of conduct. So that's how the peers are disciplined. But nonetheless, in the House there are, on a daily basis, the number of peers, I always forget because we've just had a new batch of peers appointed to the House, but there are some 780 peers who come and work regularly in the House. And on a daily basis, the attendance is round about 500 peers. And if you look at the votes, the average vote when the House divides is around the 400 to 500 mark, depending on the seriousness, contentiousness of the bill in question. And on the big bills, the contentious bills, the votes will attract more than 600 members. And for those of you who know the physical premises of the House of Lords, it's quite a small place. And if you can imagine 400 or 500 people working there in that small space every day, it's a bit like, I'm always worried about these analogies and quotations, but it's a bit like 600 schoolboys and girls coming into a small school. And take, for example, the cloakroom. For those of you who've been through the Peers' entrance, the Peers' cloakroom is, as a number of peers have commented me, rather like a school cloakroom. It's just rows of pegs where the peers come in and hang their hat and coat and take their outdoor shoes off and put their elegant indoor shoes. And you can imagine 500 peers coming through that cloakroom every day. It's quite small, the entrance is quite small, and they want to bring their guests in through the peers' entrance because it's a fast-track entrance. It's a privilege for peers' guests to use that entrance, and peers, as a consequence, have set their own rules and say, listen, a peer may only bring a maximum of 6 personal guests through the peers' entrance. If he has more than that, he or she has more than that, then they go through Cromwell Green or Blackrod's garden entrance. And do you know, it's a funny thing, but just occasionally the peers seem to forget that rule. And so you'd say, well, what does that matter if a peer brings in 8 or 9? Well, it probably doesn't matter if it's 8 or 9, but if it's 15 or 20 or 30, and then of course it clogs up peers' entrance, and instead of becoming a slick private place, privileged place where the peers can get in quickly themselves and bring in their personal guests quickly, it becomes rather like, the Heathrow airport queue trying to get through security. And the peers get pretty irritated about it when another peer or other peers bring in more than the 6. I mean, this is just to give you an example, but there are lots of other examples of minor conventions and rules which the House themselves, the members themselves have made, and they look to Blackrod to sort of remind the peers. I put it no more strongly than that. Except that I discovered, when I hadn't been in the job very long, that the peers come to me occasionally and say, listen, Blackrod, could you have a word with Baroness so-and-so or Lord so-and-so? Me and some of my colleagues are pretty irritated that he or she consistently brings through 13 people through peers' entrance, and it was a real nuisance. I got some very important guests. I got the president of so-and-so or ambassador so-and-so or the chief executive so coming to an important meeting over lunch, and they got held up by this great group of goodness knows who they were, probably undergraduates from so will you, and I say to the peers, well, why don't you have a word with the Baroness or the peer themselves? And they say, and I suppose I understand this, no, I'd rather not do that because it might be perceived that I'm perhaps politically motivated for having a complaint against them, or I'm sitting in the same committee with them and we're working through a bill and collaboratively, and I don't want to fall out over a matter like that. So please, can you deal with it? And then I said, well, why don't you go to the whips about it and get the whips to sort it out? And of course, there's always they come back with, no, we don't want to elevate this to the whips, because again, it might be seen as a bit of political point scoring, or, we need to keep this. The whips have got other important things to do. And Blackrod, get on and fix it. That's what you're here for. Isn't that what Edward III appointed you to do? And so I usually try and find a peer or leave a note for him or her. And the peers are, I must say, extremely biddable, and they are, and they usually turn up in my office within, a day or so of getting a note or a message, and normally they come into the office, very humorously normally, with their hands already up, saying, look, Blackrod, I know, I promise I'll never do it again. And the matter is dealt with very privately, between the two of us. I told the peer concerned that it's been dealt with, and so on, and that's so. I describe my role as Blackrod, and it's not just uniquely me, of course. There are others doing the same thing around the House, the Clerk of the Parliaments, the Yeoman Usher, other members of the staff. Our job in the House is to squirt oil into the machinery to make the House a convivial, slick place where the members can go about their parliamentary business. And our job is to pick out of the machinery any grit that might get into the machinery of the House. And so I would describe that as very much part of not just my role as Blackrod, but all of the administration in the House of Lords, and the same in the House of Commons too, for that matter, as part of the enablers to enable members to go about their business, and to go about their business in an ordered, convivial and convenient way. I said I'd say something more about the state opening of Parliament and the symbolism of the state opening of Parliament. The Palace of Westminster has been a royal palace. It still is partly a royal palace from the time that Henry VIII moved out in the early 16th century until 1964. And it was this Queen who decided, perhaps given the climate of the time in the 60s, quite a strong anti-monarchist movement in the country, a very strong Republican movement in the country, a very strong, vibrant, left-leaning socialist movement in the country, that it was somehow inappropriate that the monarch should own the premises of particularly the elected chamber. And so it was the Queen's idea herself that she would give to the House of Commons and to the House of Lords their respective premises and not retain them as part of the royal palace. And that was agreed to, in fact, strongly supported by the Prime Minister of the day, Harold Wilson, and was very simply enacted, in fact, through a statement in the House of Commons that was indeed what had happened. So it was only as recently as the mid-60s that the House of Commons has actually owned their own premises, if I can put in. I'm not sure that they have the freehold as such, but they have their own control of their own premises, and likewise the House of Lords. And when you walk around the Palace of Westminster, of course you see everywhere where there's green carpet and green upholstery. There are some anomalies in this. Central lobby is in fact divided into half. Half is owned by the Commons and half by the Lords, even though the upholstery all round Central lobby is green. If you go to the Pugin room, I think it's got a red carpet but green upholstery. In fact, the room belongs to the House of Lords, but it's been lent to the House of Commons. But generally speaking, what's green is Commons territory, what's crimson or red is Lords territory. And then if you look carefully, you will see that the carpeting in parts of the House of Lords is not crimson where you would expect it to be. It's blue. And blue is the royal colour for carpet. And you will see that the House of Lords chamber has blue carpet in there. Why? Because the Queen comes and walks into that chamber. And so the privilege of the House of Lords is to have a blue carpet. When the Royal Gallery is carpeted for the state opening, as you'll see, it's carpeted in blue. And if you go into the robing room, which has a permanent carpet, it's blue. And when the Queen gifted to the House of Lords and the House of Commons their respective premises, she retained some royal apartments in the palace. She retained the Sovereign's entrance and the Norman porch staircase, the robing room and the royal gallery. The robing room is very special to the Queen because it is where she robes at the state opening of Parliament. It's where she comes and puts on the state vestments in the train. It's where she puts on the crown. And indeed, for the state opening of Parliament, the robing room is set up as a robing room, as a dressing room for the Queen, with mirrors and all sorts of things. The Queen also retained, as well as the Royal Gallery and the robing room and Norman porch, she also retained Westminster Hall and the chapel of St Mary Undercroft. So there is still quite a lot of royal palace in the Palace of Westminster. And looking after the royal apartments in the Palace of Westminster, that responsibility has remained with the Lord Great Chamberlain, who I mentioned earlier. And so those are administered and managed and controlled by the Lord Great Chamberlain. The Lord Great Chamberlain is the Marquess of Cholmondeley, who I mentioned earlier, who is has considerable business interests and estates, is a very busy man, in fact, to the extent that he doesn't sit in the House. He's taken leave of absence because of his other commercial and other interests and occupations in his businesses. In fact, he only comes to the House really when he has to attend the Queen at ceremonial and state occasions. And so the Lord Great Chamberlain has a secretary in the House of Lords who is responsible and looks after, on his behalf, the royal apartments, Westminster Hall and the chapel. And the secretary of the Lord Great Chamberlain is Blackrod. So the two roles have sort of come together. And that historical tension and friction and evolution of the two roles of Lord Great Chamberlain and Blackrod, in a way, have been neatly reconciled in the last, in fact, since 1971, when Blackrod not only became the Secretary to the Lord Great Chamberlain. He took that role to relieve the Lord Great Chamberlain of the day-to-day management of the royal apartments, but the Blackrod of the day also was given the role of Sergeant-at-Arms. There had been previously a Sergeant-at-Arms as well in the House of Lords, so all those three roles rolled into one. The symbolism of the state opening of Parliament and the ownership of the Palace of Westminster in three parts, by the Commons, by the Lords and by the Crown, all comes together at state opening. There are three elements to the constitutional legislature, and that is the Commons, the Lords and the Crown. Each of those three elements owns part of the Palace of Westminster. And at the state opening of Parliament, all three of those elements are present in the Palace of Westminster. They start in their own premises, the Queen in the robing room, the Commons in the Commons, and the Lords in their chamber. And when the Queen has come to the chamber of the House of Lords and sits on the throne in the House of Lords with the royal blue carpet there, she then sends Blackrod off down to the House of Commons to summon the Commons to hear the Queen's speech, which is the outline of the government's legislative programme for the next session of Parliament. I've expired my time for speaking. I think we have another 30 minutes, is it? 30 minutes for questions. I have left a huge amount unsaid because in an hour it's hard to cover everything. Some of the subjects which you might want to tax me on, I know there's a question coming, is how Blackrod is appointed nowadays, what is the nature of the contract, another is what is the relationship with the Queen between Blackrod now and the Sovereign. What is this tradition of knocking on the door? How did that happen? What's behind all that? There's a little bit more to that story. And I'm very happy to take in questions something which is a topical thing, which as a taxpayer and a servant of the House of Lords, I'm happy to say something about the work of the Lords as I perceive it, having been, and I still consider myself, a relative new boy into the job, having done it for only 3.5 years. But I'm all yours.